All right, so get this. We're going to be diving deep into descriptions. You know, like when we say the cat or a philosopher, they seem pretty simple, but there's a whole bunch of philosophy hiding in there.
Yeah, and it gets really interesting because you start asking some fundamental questions about language and logic and even reality itself. Like, how do these phrases actually pick out things in the world? And what about when they don't refer to anything, like the present king of France? That's the kind of stuff philosophers love to argue about.
I can already see how this is going to be a fun one. We're talking about those phrases with the and an, right? Like the definite and indefinite descriptions. The philosopher who wrote Being and Nothingness versus a philosopher who enjoys existential dread.
You got it. And one of the big names in this whole description debate was Bertrand Russell. His work really changed how we think about the logic behind these expressions.
Ah, Russell. He always seems to pop up when things get conceptually tricky.
Yeah.
What was his big idea about descriptions?
Well, Russell argued that descriptions aren't just simple labels that we stick onto things. They actually have this hidden logical structure, a kind of code we need to crack to understand what they really mean. Imagine you have a sentence like, "The philosopher who wrote Critique of Pure Reason is brilliant." Russell would say there are actually three different claims packed into that sentence.
Three claims. Sounds like we'll need our philosophical magnifying glasses for this one. So what are these hidden assertions lurking beneath the surface?
Okay, so first you have the existence claim. It's basically saying, hey, there really is a philosopher who wrote Critique of Pure Reason out there. It might seem obvious, but it's important for avoiding logical problems, which we'll see later.
All right, so existence is claim number one. What's next?
The second claim is about uniqueness. It's saying there's only one person who fits that description. Not a bunch of philosophers who all wrote the same book, but just one singular genius.
One philosopher, one masterpiece. Got it. But you said there were three claims, right? What's the final piece of the puzzle?
The third part is the maximality claim, and it's saying everything that's true of the philosopher who wrote Critique of Pure Reason is also true of being brilliant. In other words, if you find that philosopher, you're guaranteed to find someone brilliant. It's like saying that being the author of that book automatically implies brilliance.
So it's not just that some things true of that philosopher are also true of being brilliant. It's everything. That's a pretty strong claim.
Yeah.
But why go through all this trouble? Why not just say descriptions, pick out things in the world and be done with it?
Because Russell was wrestling with some really big philosophical problems. He wanted to avoid the weirdness of saying that things that don't exist can still have properties. Like if someone says, the present king of France is bald, we don't want to imply there's actually a bald king of France hiding out somewhere, right?
I see. So by breaking down descriptions into these three claims, Russell avoids having to say that something non-existent somehow has the property of being bald. That's clever. What other philosophical headaches was he trying to solve with this analysis?
Well, think about the statement, the morning star is the evening star. For a long time, people thought those were two different objects in the sky, but then they realized it was just Venus appearing at different times. So Russell's theory explains how two different descriptions can refer to the same thing while still having distinct meanings.
So even though morning star and evening star both point to Venus, they give us a different information about how we identify it. Fascinating. It seems like Russell was also interested in how this connects to knowledge too, right?
Absolutely. He distinguished between knowledge by acquaintance, where we directly experience something, and knowledge by description, where we know about something through a description of it. And that relates to how descriptions can give us different ways of knowing the same thing.
Wow, this is giving me a whole new perspective on how language, logic, and knowledge all fit together. It's like Russell is giving us this new lens through which to view the world. But I'm curious, did he stop at just analyzing the and a? Did he try to apply this framework to other parts of language?
Oh yeah, definitely. He thought his theory could be applied to other things, like proper names. For example, he even suggested that a name like Aristotle might actually be shorthand for a description, like the student of Plato who taught Alexander.
Wait, are you saying every time we say Aristotle, we're secretly using a hidden description? That seems pretty radical. Did people actually buy that?
It definitely caused a stir, and we'll get into those debates a bit later. But before we jump into all that, let's first see how his theory was extended beyond those classic the and a descriptions.
Okay, I'm ready to expand my linguistic horizons. Lead the way.
Well, one place descriptions came in handy was in understanding pronouns like he and she. You know, think of that classic joke set up. A man walked into a bar. He ordered a drink.
I think I can guess where this is going. But seriously, how do those pronouns connect back to the nouns they're replacing?
Well, some philosophers, following Russell's lead, thought that pronouns might actually be descriptions in disguise. So in that joke, he would be like saying, the man who walked into the bar. Seems like a simple word, but there's a lot packed in there.
So pronouns are secret descriptions doing undercover work? I love it. But why go through all that trouble? What problem does it solve?
It helps us deal with those tricky cases where a pronoun doesn't actually refer to anything, like, the present king of France is bald, he doesn't exist either. If he was just a simple referring expression, we'd be in trouble. We'd have to say a non-existent king somehow has properties. But if we treat it as a description, then it inherits the same logical structure as the present king of France and avoids that problem.
Ah, that's a neat trick. This whole description business is way more powerful than I first thought. Did Russell and his followers stop at pronouns, though? Did they find descriptions hiding anywhere else?
They went even further. They started applying descriptions to expressions of time and possibility. Imagine then in a sentence like, I went to the store, then I went home. They thought it might actually stand in for a hidden when clause, like when I had finished shopping. Or words like that in that would have been a disaster, they argued, could represent whole conditional statements like, if that had happened, it would have been a disaster.
Wow, it's like descriptions are everywhere. It's making me realize how much depth there is to language. But hold on, before we get too carried away, I have to ask, did anyone object to all this? Did anyone challenge Russell's big picture view of descriptions?
Oh, for sure. No philosophical theory escapes scrutiny, and Russell's theory of descriptions definitely attracted its share of criticism.
Ah, the philosophical brawl. I wouldn't want it any other way. So what were the main objections? What were people pushing back against?
Well, some people questioned whether Russell got the truth conditions right for sentences with non-referring descriptions. And then there's the whole question of how we use descriptions. Sometimes to pick out whoever fits a description, sometimes to refer to a specific individual, even if they don't perfectly match.
Okay, yeah, we're going to need to unpack all of that. Anything else?
Oh, yeah. There's also the problem of incomplete descriptions, like when you say the table. But there are actually multiple tables around. Critics argued that Russell's analysis, with its focus on uniqueness, couldn't really handle these common cases.
So many philosophical knots to untangle. I'm really looking forward to digging into those objections and seeing how Russell's defenders responded. But for now, I think we need a little break to absorb all of this. Our minds are starting to feel as densely packed as those descriptions.
Agreed. Let's pause here and give these ideas some time to settle. We'll be back soon to tackle those objections and explore even more radical challenges to Russell's theory of descriptions. Welcome back to our deep dive into descriptions. Before the break, we talked about Bertrand Russell's theory and hinted at some of the objections people raised.
You said objections. Well, I'm ready to hear about them. Where do we start?
Let's start with this challenge to Russell's truth conditions. Specifically, how his theory handles those non-referring descriptions, like the present king of France. This critique came from the philosopher P.F. Strawson.
Right, the non-existent monarch. What was Strawson's problem with Russell's analysis?
Strawson argued that Russell got the truth conditions wrong for sentences like, the present king of France is bald. Remember, Russell said this sentence is false because it implies there is a French king? But Strawson thought that our intuition is that it's not exactly false. It's more like it doesn't have a truth value at all.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like it's asking us to judge the baldness of someone who doesn't even exist. It's like a nonsensical request. So what did Strawson propose instead?
He said that descriptions don't directly assert existence, they presuppose it. So if that presupposition fails, like in our King of France example, the sentence just doesn't have a truth value. It's neither true nor false. Kind of like a question that's based on a false premise.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. So for Strawson, the present king of France is bald isn't false. It's more like assuming there is a present king of France and there isn't, is he bald? It really makes you think. So how did Russell respond to that?
Well, Russell, being the sharp logician he was, he countered with a thought experiment. He imagined a country where to get a government job you had to affirm the wisdom of the ruler of the universe. So would an atheist, using Strawson's logic, be able to get the job by saying they don't think that proposition is false? Russell thought that would be a pretty sneaky move.
Huh. It's always fun to see philosophers using logic to find the loopholes. It seems like this debate about truth conditions might come down to different intuitions. Is there even a clear winner between Russell and Strawson?
That's the thing about philosophy. Sometimes the most interesting questions don't really have neat and tidy answers. The debate between Russell and Strawson definitely got people thinking about presuppositions and how it relates to truth. Some saw it as a stalemate, while others, like Stephen Neal, argued that Strawson's view doesn't always match up with our intuitions. For instance, my mother is dating the present king of France seems false, even though there's no French king.
So the truth conditions debate is still very much alive. What about that other challenge you mentioned, the one about how we use descriptions in different ways?
Right. This distinction comes from Keith Donnellan. He argued that we use descriptions in two ways. Sometimes we use them attributively to pick out whoever or whatever fits the description. It doesn't matter if we have a specific individual in mind. Think of a detective saying, the murderer of Smith is a psychopath, meaning whoever did it must be crazy.
Right, they're not talking about a specific person, just whoever fits the description. What's the other way we use descriptions?
The other way is referentially, where we use a description to refer to a specific individual, even if they don't perfectly fit the description. Imagine at a trial, someone pointing at the defendant and saying, the murderer of Smith is insane, even if they doubt the defendant actually did it. They're using the description to pick out that person, regardless of whether the description is accurate.
Ah, that makes sense. So Donnellan's saying Russell's analysis might work for attributive uses, but not so much for referential uses where we're pointing at someone specific.
Mhm.
How did Russell's supporters deal with that?
Well, Saul Kripke came to Russell's defense, and he used pragmatics, the idea that what we mean can go beyond what we literally say. He argued that even in those referential uses, we're still making a claim about whoever fits the description, but we use context to signal who we're really talking about.
Like we're smuggling in some extra information based on the situation. Pretty clever. So does that solve the problem of misdescription, where the description doesn't quite fit the person we're talking about?
It does in a lot of cases, like that courtroom example. Even if the person being pointed at isn't the murderer, we understand what the speaker means. What they literally said might be false, but they got their meaning across.
So pragmatics saves the day, at least some of the time. But you said there was still some residue of the misdescription problem. What cases does Kripke's idea miss?
The trouble comes when the description isn't just a little bit off, but really wrong. Imagine that detective again saying the murderer is insane. But it turns out there were actually multiple people involved, all of them crazy. Even with pragmatics, it's hard to say if their statement is true or false.
Oh, a genuine philosophical puzzle. The description is partially accurate. There were insane murderers, but it misses a key part of the situation. So is it true, false, or somewhere in between? It makes your head spin. What about that other challenge we talked about, the problem of incomplete descriptions? Does Russell's theory do any better there?
The problem of incomplete descriptions, yeah, that's another tricky one for Russell. The classic example is saying the table is covered with books when there are actually lots of tables in the room.
Right. The table is incomplete because it doesn't tell us which table we're talking about. It seems like Russell's analysis, with its focus on uniqueness, would force us to say there's only one table in the world. How did Russell's supporters try to address this?
One way was to appeal to context. They said, we just fill in the missing information based on the situation, so the table might really mean the table in this room or the table near me.
Okay, so we're adding those unspoken details to make the description complete. But is that always possible? Do we always have a specific table in mind when we say the table? Wouldn't that just lead to us adding more and more details to make it unique? It seems like a slippery slope.
I think you're right to be skeptical. Relying on unspoken context can get messy, and it might not capture how we actually use descriptions.
Yeah. And what about those cases where it's not just incomplete, but also ambiguous? Like, I put the book on the book. It's pretty clear we're talking about two different books, even though we're using the same description.
That's a great example of where that context-based solution falls apart. It seems like we need something more to handle those cases.
Definitely. So we've got these lingering problems with truth conditions, referential uses, misdescription, and incomplete descriptions. It sounds like Russell's theory is taking a beating. But before we give up on it, I have to ask, did anyone try to save it by changing the core analysis? Did anyone try to tweak those three claims, the existence, uniqueness, and maximality, to make it work better?
Oh, you're in for a treat. Some philosophers and linguists really liked Russell's ideas but knew about the problems. They tried to refine, revise, even revolutionize his whole theory of descriptions.
Sounds like a major philosophical renovation. Tell me more. What kind of changes did they propose? All right, so what did they change? Which part of Russell's theory did they try to fix first?
The biggest change was to the uniqueness claim, the idea that the F always picks out one and only one F. Some philosophers and linguists actually suggested that maybe the and A aren't so different after all.
Whoa, wait a minute. Are you saying that the cat and a cat could actually mean the same thing? That's a huge shift from what we've been talking about.
It is, but the idea is that the difference between them might not be about their core meaning, but about how we use them in different situations. It's more about pragmatics than semantics.
Okay, so my brain is trying to keep up here. How could they mean the same thing when they seem to do totally different jobs in language?
Well, think about synonyms like but and. They both connect ideas, but implies a contrast, right? So the and a both signal existence, but the tells us that we're talking about something that's already familiar, something that's already part of the conversation.
So the cat is like saying, hey, remember that cat we were talking about? It exists, while a cat is introducing a new one. I think I see where you're going with this. But how does this unified view of descriptions help with those problems we talked about before, the ones that Russell's theory had trouble with?
Remember the detective who said the murderer is insane, but it turned out there were multiple murderers? Well, this analysis suggests that what they actually said was just that at least one of the murderers was insane, which is true. The mistake about there only being one murderer was just an assumption we added, not part of what they literally said.
Ah, I see. By separating the semantics from the pragmatics, we can make sense of those weird cases where what's said is technically true, but the speaker still gets things wrong. That's pretty neat.
It is. And this approach can also help with the problem of incomplete descriptions. When someone says, the table is covered with books, they're not saying that there's only one table in existence. They're just saying that at least one table fits that description, and we use context to figure out which one they mean.
Okay, I can see how this is a more flexible and nuanced way to understand descriptions, but I'm sure there were some objections to this radical new idea. Did anyone push back against dissolving the distinction between the and a?
Of course, there's always debate in philosophy. Some philosophers, like Barbara Abbott, argued that this pragmatic account doesn't quite get it right because the uniqueness implication of the can't always be canceled. Like, it sounds weird to say Russell was the author of Principia Mathematica, but actually, there were two Russells.
That's a good point. It does seem like we're stuck with uniqueness in that case. So does that mean this whole unified analysis is a dead end?
Not necessarily. Others have said that the uniqueness might be part of the meaning of author and not the. After all, Russell was a co-author of Principia Mathematica, not the sole author. And there are plenty of cases where we can cancel that uniqueness implication, like John went to the doctor. In fact, he went to two doctors to get a second opinion.
Right, that makes sense. So the uniqueness debate is still ongoing. But what about the other two parts of Russell's analysis? The existence and maximality claims. Does anyone question those?
They did. We already talked about how some philosophers, like Paul Elburn and Peter Schobe, have argued that the existence claim isn't always part of what's being asserted, especially when descriptions are embedded in more complex sentences.
Can you give me an example of when that existence claim gets a little iffy?
Sure. Think about John wants the ghost in the attic to be quiet. It would be weird to say that John actually wants there to be a ghost. He just wants whatever is making noise to shut up.
Right, his desire is about the noise, not about a ghost existing or not.
Exactly. And the same kind of issue comes up with other types of sentences too, like questions, modal statements, even sometimes with negation.
So we can't just assume that a description always implies existence. What about maximality? Remember, that was the idea that the F is G means that everything that is F is also G. Did that idea run into any trouble?
It did, especially when we look at plural descriptions like the dogs or mass terms like the water. If you say the dogs are barking, you probably don't mean that literally every single dog is barking.
Right, and saying the water is gold doesn't mean you're talking about the entire ocean.
Exactly. So these cases suggest that the maximality claim might be a bit too strong, at least in some contexts.
Wow, so even those three basic parts of Russell's analysis have been challenged and revised. Where does all this leave us? Is there anything left of Russell's theory, or has it been completely destroyed by these critiques?
Well, while Russell's original version might need some tweaking, his basic insights are still really important. He showed us that descriptions are way more complicated than they seem, and that understanding their logical structure can tell us a lot about meaning, reference, and even knowledge.
So it's not about holding on to every detail of what Russell said, but more about appreciating the impact his ideas had. He really opened up a whole new way of thinking about language.
Absolutely. And the conversation about descriptions definitely isn't over. Lately, linguists have been getting involved too, and they're bringing in new ideas from syntax, semantics, and even from studying how language evolved.
Interesting. What have they found out about the and a?
Well, one thing they've questioned is whether those words are really unique, with their own special meanings. Some linguists think they might actually work more like predicates, or even as case markers, kind of like what you see in languages with lots of inflections.
Wait, so you're saying the might be doing the same job as those suffixes and prefixes in languages like Latin, the ones that tell you the grammatical role of a word?
Yeah, that's the idea. This research suggests that descriptions might be more fluid and context dependent than we thought, and that their meaning might be spread out across the whole sentence, not just located in those little words the and a.
Wow, we've come a long way from Russell's logical analysis to the nitty-gritty details of grammar. It's amazing how much philosophy we found hiding in the and a.
It just shows how much we still have to learn about language, even in the most basic parts. What started with Russell trying to clarify language and logic has led us to rethink some fundamental ideas about reference, meaning, and the very building blocks of language.
It's incredible how such a small concept can reveal so much about how we think and communicate.
For sure. We've only just scratched the surface here. There are still so many linguistic and philosophical puzzles out there for us to explore.
Well, I know my mind is buzzing with new ideas. I'm definitely going to be looking at descriptions differently from now on.
I think we all should. The next time you see a the or an a, just remember that beneath those simple words is a whole world of philosophical complexity still waiting to be fully understood.
That's a great point to end on. We'll leave everyone to ponder those mysteries of descriptions. Until next time, keep on diving deep.